from the News Channel 5 network. This is Urban Outlook.
Hello and welcome to Urban Outlook. I'm April Eaton. Thank you so much for being with us today. You know, there's a tour of a different kind on the grounds of the Belle Meade Plantation. You would expect, of course, a tour of the home, the history, and the grounds and generations of the family, the white family, of course, that occupied the home. But this Belle Meade tour is called Journey to Jubilee, and it's focused on the slaves and families, those often forgotten stories and perspectives. Bridget Jones is the Director of African American Studies at the Belle Meade Plantation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So as I said, you often hear about the generations of the families who live in the plantation, in the main house, I guess we should say. But there's often little story to tell about the groundskeepers, the slaves who lived on those same plantations. Talk a little bit about how Journey to Jubilee came about.
So initially, the project started way before my time at Belle Meade. Initially, it started with Jenny Lamb, who was the director of the site at the time, Director of Education and Interpretation. So I'd say about 2006, 2007, they launched what was pretty much the research part of it. Who were the people? What were their names? What did they do? How did they live? That then turned into a full-on exhibit inside of the replica of the slave cabin. Following Jenny's departure, it kind of took a bit of a backseat for a moment as Belle Meade restructured where it was trying to go with its interpretation. During that time period, I was no longer at Belle Meade. So when I returned, they had decided that they were going to begin to launch Journey to Jubilee as a full-on tour, which was amazing to me. So they decided to not only make it a tour, but to make it a tour that only focused on the lives of the enslaved. So it took them quite a while to really begin to decide that this is something that is necessary, and it feels the interpretation. It doesn't take away from it.
Whenever you do that kind of research, though, it's hard to find those records. So were records kept on Belle Meade's property that talked about all of the slaves who were there, all of the families who were there?
Yes and no. So we have census records. Census records in 1860 are going to list 136 people. None of those individuals are named on the 1860 census record. So there's like a tick mark, and it's going to be followed by an age, a sex, and a race. Now, that didn't give me anything.
Okay.
As far as names. It told me how many people were there by 1860, which is technically the height of enslavement. Now, I have to go through family letters. The family letters will detail their day-to-day lives. These are the things that were happening in their community, in their social lives at that point in time. So they do have certain mentions of different individuals in those family letters. They may not go into deep detail, but they're there.
And the family letters you're talking about are the Jackson Harding family,
yes,
right?
ma'am.
So talk about, let's get to the history of that family.
Yes.
Who lived on that plantation?
Yes, so the Harding and Jackson family started with John Harding. John Harding is from Goochland County, Virginia. He migrates to Tennessee from Virginia around 1798 or so, and establishes Belle Meade in 1807. 1807, at that point, Belle Meade just 250 acres. He and his wife will have 3 children that survive into adulthood. William Giles Harding will inherit the Belle Meade Plantation around 1840. Now, William Giles is going to continue to grow the plantation from 1840 until his death in 1886. At that point, his daughter will inherit it, but because of the law surrounding women at that time, she can't really own the plantation. So technically it falls to her husband. That's General William Hicks Jackson. So that's where you get that name change. Okay. So they're the 3rd generation owners. They will continue the management of the estate until both of their deaths. Then their children will inherit it. By the early 1900s, in the 4th generation, the estate is severely in debt. Eventually it'll be sold around 1906.
And then, so when you talk about the letters of the family in regards to conversations or dialogue or journaling about the slaves, talk a little bit about what those look like and what stories were told.
Absolutely. So sadly, in many of the family letters, you don't get this insight into who these enslaved people were as individuals.
Because they were just property, right?
They were just property, yes. So a lot of the mentions of them would be things like, I ran into Toby and Rael down in the hog patch the other day, and the hogs are getting large. I think Rael and Toby's doing a fine job. These types of things, they're very minute. They don't give you a lot of insight, but there are mentioned, and that allows me to just have a name. So I know somebody named Toby was here. I know Rael was here. I know Gloria or Sharon was here. The only people that are specifically mentioned in detail are a woman named Susanna Carter and a man named Bob Green. Those are the two major enslaved players that we have the most interpretation about because they have the most detail about their family history.
And is there any detail about how they purchased or why they purchased so many and all of the individual jobs that they needed to be done there on the plantation?
Yes. So John Harding is the one that purchases the majority of the slaves, or the enslaved people. John Harding will purchase most of the foundation of the enslaved individuals. By the time William Giles Harding has taken over the estate, by what the 1860 census shows, that's natural growth. So there's a lot of procreation happening on the plantation. So William Giles doesn't seem to have been...
So those slaves are making families.
They're making families, yeah. So a lot of the 1860 census records, a lot of those people are under the age of 20. So these were a lot of young people, which shows me that these people were born at Belle Meade in most cases, which also means that William Giles Harding probably was not purchasing as many enslaved individuals as his father would have been.
Gotcha.
So that growth is natural over time. Now, owning lots of slaves, it's common. It's a show of wealth in that point in time. So a lot of people will own a lot of enslaved individuals, not because they need 140 people, but because they can have them.
And so from those letters, from the dialogue that the family may have been having back then, captured in their letters, you're able to piece together the story of slavery on Belle Meade's plantation.
Absolutely.
Talk more about what that story looked like.
Yeah, so at Belle Meade, because Belle Meade isn't growing a cash crop, cotton, tobacco, sugarcane, they're raising horses. So slavery looks very different at Belle Meade. That's not to say that it was better than anywhere else, but it gave them a different life. A lot of the individuals at Belle Meade that were enslaved would have been skilled laborers. These are jockeys and horse trainers and hostlers. And then you, of course, have people that would have worked in the house, and then they have high pasture because they have different livestock and things that they would have been also using as sources of income. But slavery at Belle Meade is a very unique type of slavery. And many of the enslaved individuals at Belle Meade actually went on to do fairly well post-emancipation. Middle Tennessee slavery in general gives a different foundation for enslaved individuals because so many people in Middle Tennessee were skilled. Cash crops weren't the main source of income for many Middle Tennessee plantations, which allows African Americans to really translate those skills that they have into paying jobs post-emancipation. Belle Meade is just like that.
Interesting. So let's talk about this tour so that people can experience what it was like. And I think you said in the bio that you sent us that your goal is for people to take a walk in a slave's shoes. What's the reaction to that, I wonder?
When I initially say it, people don't know what they're getting into. It's kind of like, well, I wanted to hear about them, but I don't know how I feel about trying to take a walk in their shoes.
Right.
But I think it puts people in the mindset to understand that we're gonna talk about this, and we're not gonna talk about this in a way that's gonna make you comfortable. We're gonna talk about this in a way that will make you very uncomfortable, because that's where the growth comes from. So we literally go from what were the slave quarters. We walk from the slave quarters up to the mansion. We don't use the front door because they don't use the front door. We use the back door. We use the servants' stairs. We use the servants' entrance. And we're gonna meet different people as we go along the tour. We're gonna discuss their lives and their perspectives and their experiences. We discuss primary source documents. You get to see runaway slave ads. You're gonna read them for yourself. We're gonna talk about the language and draw those parallels in between how the issues of that society then are still plaguing our society today. So many of the racial issues that we have in America now are rooted in that time period. And so we want to make sure that we draw those connections, because museums are not neutral. They're not neutral. If you want to talk about race relations, plantations are the place that you should start, because that's where current race relations were developed in America.
I want to take a little bit of a break, and when we come back, I want to talk more about that experience that people get, and also talk to you about who's taking the tour and the reactions between those groups of folks who may be coming through Belle Meade. We'll be right back after this. Stay with us.